Leave her where the storm can finish what mercy could not, the Raven Hollow Alpha said. And the last face Evelyn Harper saw before the world turned white was not angry, not grieving, not even ashamed. It was bored. Snow gathered on her lashes as the sleigh bells faded into the pine-dark distance, soft and silver and impossibly cruel. She lay half-buried at the edge of Frostpine Ridge, 20 miles from the nearest road, her gray dress stiff with ice at the hem, her wrists bound in cold silver cord that burned more with humiliation than pain. Above her, the night sky was a sheet of iron. Around her, the forest breathed in slow, frozen silence, as if even the trees had been warned not to speak her name. Evelyn tried to lift her head, but the world tipped sideways. The slope beneath her was steep, packed with old snow and broken branches, and every breath scraped through her chest like winter itself had taken hold of her lungs. She could still hear them, not with her ears, but in the place where belonging used to live. Traitor, thief, curse, Omega. The words had followed her from the pack hall to the forest line, thrown harder than stones, colder than the storm. They had not asked why she had been in the old stable after midnight. They had not asked why there had been a frightened little boy hidden beneath the hay, wrapped in her shawl, trembling too hard to say his own name. They had not cared that his eyes had been silver, bright and strange, the kind of silver people whispered about in stories of royal blood and ancient wolves. Evelyn had only seen a child alone in the cold, so she had helped him. She had given him water from a tin cup, tied a strip of her sleeve around his scraped hand, and told him the one promise she had always wished someone would make to her. You're safe with me. Now that promise was the only thing left warm inside her. Her fingers curled weakly around a small cloth tucked against her palm, the boy's handkerchief, white once, now marked with dirt and melted snow. He had dropped it before the men came, before the shouting, before Alpha Grant Hale looked at her with fear dressed up as judgment and told the pack she had hidden a royal child for ransom. Evelyn had waited for one voice to rise. Grace Miller had seen her carry the boy from the storm. Old Mrs. Bell had eaten soup Evelyn brought every Sunday. The stable hands knew Evelyn never took what was not hers, not even an extra loaf from the kitchen when hunger hollowed her stomach. But silence had filled the hall faster than truth ever could. So they dragged her beyond the border, beyond the reach of the pack bond, beyond the place where an Omega's life might still be inconvenient to explain. The silver cord around her wrists glittered under the moon, neat and ceremonial, as if cruelty became noble when tied properly. Evelyn laughed once, or tried to. It came out as a breath. She was not brave in the way songs praised. She was not fierce. She had no great wolf rising inside her, no sharp command that could make stronger people kneel. She was only a young woman in a plain gray dress, with dark hair frozen against her cheek and a heart that kept choosing kindness even when kindness never chose her back. The wind shifted, pushing snow over her shoulder, then her waist. She looked toward the black line of pines where the sleigh had disappeared and whispered, "Little one, I hope you made it home." Her voice vanished into the storm. Far away, beyond the ridge, something answered, not a voice, not a howl, but the sudden halt of hooves in deep snow. A royal warhorse stamped once, then another. In the darkness, a man in black armor raised one gloved hand, and an entire column of riders stopped, as if the mountain itself had commanded them. Alpha King Cassian Blackwood turned his head toward the buried hollow, his crimson cloak snapping behind him like a banner of blood against the white night. His guards heard only wind. His wolf heard a heartbeat fading under the snow. Before winter made a grave of Frostpine Ridge, Evelyn Harper had spent her life learning how to be small enough not to offend anyone. In Raven Hollow, power had a scent. It filled the pack hall when alphas entered, sharp as pine smoke, heavy as thunder before rain. Betas carried confidence in their shoulders. Warriors carried it in their scars, and even children learned early to bare their teeth before they learned to say please. Evelyn carried none of it. Her wolf was quiet, her scent faint, her steps careful. At 22, she still lived in the narrow room above the laundry shed, where the roof leaked during spring storms and the walls held the smell of soap, ash, and old wood. She woke before dawn to mend uniforms, scrub floors, feed the elderly, and disappear before the important families came down to breakfast. No one called her cruel names when they needed warm blankets folded or fever tea prepared. They saved those words for the moments when kindness had already been used and could be thrown away. Do not stand near the front. Grace Miller had whispered to her at every ceremony, not unkindly, but not bravely either. You know how they get when they remember you are there. Evelyn always nodded, because arguing only made people look longer. She was not ugly, though the pack sometimes spoke as if weakness could stain a face. She had soft pale skin that flushed easily in the cold, long black hair she braided down her back because it was practical, and dark eyes that noticed everything people wished she would miss. She noticed when children hid bruised pride behind loud laughter. She noticed when old hunters pretended their hands did not shake. She noticed when a frightened animal needed stillness more than command. That was her gift, if it could be called one. She could calm what trembled. She could sit beside pain without making it feel ashamed. Raven Hollow did not value such things. A gentle Omega is still an Omega, Alpha Grant Hale once said during a winter feast, loud enough for everyone to hear. Useful, perhaps, but never necessary. The room had laughed, and Evelyn had lowered her eyes, even as she placed a bowl of soup in front of his mother because the old woman had forgotten to eat. The truth was, Evelyn had never wanted a crown, a title, or revenge. She wanted a locked door that belonged to her, a fire that did not go out by midnight, and one person in the world who would not look embarrassed to be kind to her. Then, 3 nights before the storm, she found the boy. The stable behind the east pasture had been abandoned since the roof sagged under last year's snowfall. Evelyn went there to leave scraps for a half-wild barn cat, carrying a lantern under her cloak so no patrol would accuse her of stealing oil. She heard him before she saw him, a tiny breath caught between a sob and a prayer. He was curled behind a broken grain bin, no older than 7 or 8, with dark hair damp from melted snow and silver eyes too bright for an ordinary child. His coat was fine but torn at the sleeve, the kind of stitching no Raven Hollow family could afford. When Evelyn knelt, he flinched as if kindness itself had become dangerous. "I will not hurt you," she said softly, setting the lantern down several feet away. "My name is Evelyn." The boy stared at her for a long moment, then whispered, "They told me not to say mine." Fear moved through her, quiet and cold. She should have called the patrol. She should have run to the pack house. Instead, she saw his shaking hands and the way he tried not to cry, and every rule in her life became smaller than the child in front of her. She wrapped him in her gray shawl, gave him water, and warmed his fingers between her palms until his breathing slowed. "You are safe with me," she promised, because no one had ever said it to her when it mattered. Outside, the wind dragged snow across the pasture, covering tracks, hiding secrets, and carrying toward Raven Hollow the first whisper of royal riders searching for a missing prince. By morning, the royal riders had reached the outer road, and Raven Hollow began to tremble beneath the weight of a truth no one wanted to face. The first horn sounded just after sunrise, low and mournful, rolling across the frozen fields until every window in the pack village opened and every conversation died. Evelyn heard it from the laundry shed with the boy asleep beneath a pile of clean blankets beside the stove. He had finally stopped shaking an hour earlier, one small hand curled around the edge of her sleeve as if she might vanish if he let go. She had not slept. She had sat on the wooden floor with her back against the wall, listening to the wind and watching the child breathe, trying to decide what kind of danger wore a coat stitched with royal thread. Then the second horn came, closer this time. The boy woke with a gasp, silver eyes wide, and whispered, "They found the road." Evelyn knelt beside him. "Who did?" He looked toward the door as footsteps began pounding outside. "The men who took me." The handle rattled before Evelyn could answer. Grace Miller burst in first, pale and breathless, her blonde braid half undone beneath her hood. Behind her came 2 of Alpha Grant Hale's guards, their expressions hard with purpose. Grace saw the boy, saw the fine coat, saw Evelyn's shawl around his shoulders, and her face changed. Not with understanding, with fear. "Evelyn," she whispered, "what did you do?" The words landed softly, but they opened something terrible. Evelyn stood, placing herself between Grace and the child. "I found him in the old stable. He was freezing. He needed help." One guard stepped forward. "Alpha Hale wants you in the hall. Both of you." The boy grabbed Evelyn's hand so tightly his fingers shook. "No," he said, small but clear. Not him. He was there. The guard's eyes flickered. Grace heard it too. For 1 second, truth stood in the room with them, fragile and breathing. Then fear crushed it. By noon, the entire pack had crowded into the great hall, boots wet with snow, voices buzzing like trapped bees. Evelyn stood at the center in her plain gray dress, the boy hidden somewhere behind Alpha Hale's private doors. She had asked to stay with him. They had refused. Alpha Grant Hale sat in his carved chair beneath the black antlers of Raven Hollow, his broad hands folded, his face arranged into sorrow for the audience. Beside him stood his sister, Marin Hale, and 3 guards who would not meet Evelyn's eyes. "This Omega has placed us all in danger," Grant announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "A royal child was found concealed under her care, and she cannot explain why." Evelyn's chest tightened. "I did explain. I found him alone. I helped him." Murmurs swept through the room, restless and hungry. Grant looked at her the way powerful men looked at small truths, as if truth was only rude when spoken by someone weak. "You expect us to believe a prince wandered into your hands by chance?" "Prince." The word rippled through the hall. Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her. The child with silver eyes, the fine coat, the careful way he had refused to say his name. Prince Rowan Blackwood, the missing son of Alpha King Cashin. Grace stood near the front, wringing her gloves. Evelyn found her eyes and held them. "Say it," Evelyn begged without speaking. "Tell them you saw me carry him in from the cold. Tell them he was afraid. Tell them I did not hide him for harm." Grace's lips parted. Alpha Hale turned his gaze toward her, calm and warning. Grace looked down. Silence answered for her. Something inside Evelyn folded, not because she was surprised, but because some foolish, tender piece of her had still hoped kindness might be remembered. "I never wanted a reward," Evelyn said, her voice thin but steady. "I did not even know who he was." Marin Hale stepped forward with a small white handkerchief pinched between 2 fingers, the one Evelyn had tucked into her pocket. "Then why keep this?" she asked. "A token from the royal heir. Proof enough of intent." Evelyn stared at it, and the room blurred at the edges. That little cloth had been the only thing she held because the boy had been real, because saving him had mattered, because she wanted to return it when he was safe. Now they made it look like evidence of a crime. Grant rose slowly. "Until the king arrives, we will protect Raven Hollow from the shame she brought upon us." He did not say what he meant in front of the children, the elders, the people who preferred cruelty dressed in ceremony. He only nodded to his guards. They took Evelyn by the arms, not roughly enough to shock the room, but firmly enough that no one could pretend she was free. As they led her toward the side doors, she looked once more at Grace. Tears shone in Grace's eyes. Still, she said nothing. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and clean, covering every footprint as if the world itself was willing to help Raven Hollow lie. They did not take Evelyn through the front doors, where the pack could see the full shape of what they were doing. They led her through the narrow service corridor behind the kitchens, past hanging herbs, stacked firewood, and the warm smell of bread she had helped bake before dawn. The ordinary kindness of those things nearly broke her. A loaf cooling on the table, a kettle humming softly, a child's mitten left beside the door. Life continuing, as if a young woman could be erased from it without leaving a space behind. The guards said nothing as they fastened a silver cord around her wrists, ceremonial enough to look lawful, cold enough to remind her that Raven Hollow had never needed chains to make her feel trapped. Grace followed at a distance, her boots whispering over the stone. Evelyn did not turn around. She could feel her there, the trembling guilt, the words rising and dying before they reached the air. At the back entrance, Alpha Grant Hale waited with his cloak drawn high against the wind. Beside him stood Marin, smooth-faced and composed, holding the little white handkerchief as though it offended her. "The royal party is closer than expected," Grant said to the guards. "No mistakes." Evelyn looked at him then. Snowlight fell across his face, making him seem carved from something pale and unfeeling. "Where is the boy?" she asked. Grant's jaw tightened. "You lost the right to ask questions. He was afraid of someone here." The words came softly, but they struck hard enough that one guard glanced aside. Marin stepped closer, her voice low and sweet in the way poison might sound if it learned manners. "A frightened child says many things. A desperate Omega repeats them." Evelyn's throat tightened, but she held her ground as much as the cord allowed. He said one of your men was there. For a moment, the wind seemed to pause beneath the eaves. Grant's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with calculation. That frightened her more. Take her beyond the north marker, he ordered. Leave her where the storm will confuse her trail. By morning, she will be gone, and we will tell the king she fled with his son's token. Grace made a small sound. Not a protest. Not yet. Just the wounded breath of someone watching the truth become something else. Evelyn finally turned to her. Grace, she whispered. Her old friend's eyes filled. They had once shared apples behind the schoolhouse, once stitched ribbons into each other's hair for the moon festival, once promised that if the world was cruel, at least they would not be cruel to each other. But promises made in childhood were fragile things when power entered the room. I am sorry, Grace mouthed. Evelyn wished she had not. Sorry was too small to hold a life. The sleigh waited behind the kitchens, runners half buried in fresh snow. They placed Evelyn inside without ceremony, between two guards who stared straight ahead as if she were already a memory. As the horses moved, Raven Hollow slipped behind her in pieces. The smoke rising from chimneys, the dark outline of the hall, the laundry shed window where her little room waited with an unmade cot and a cracked blue cup on the sill. No one would pack her things. No one would water the rosemary plant she had kept alive through 3 winters. The road north climbed through dense pine, each mile colder than the last. Evelyn kept her fingers wrapped around the handkerchief she had managed to hide again in her sleeve when Marin looked away. Prince Rowan's cloth. Proof not of guilt, but of a child who had trusted her. The sleigh stopped at Frostpine Ridge as dusk thickened into a blue-gray dark. The trees stood close together there, their branches heavy, their shadows long. One guard untied the side gate. The other would not meet her eyes. Evelyn stepped down because she refused to be pushed. Her thin shoes sank into the snow. Grant had not come this far. Of course he had not. Powerful people rarely watched the ending of the stories they wrote for the powerless. Please, Evelyn said, not for herself. Tell the boy I did not leave him. Neither guard answered. They turned the sleigh around. The bells faded. The tracks began filling almost at once. Evelyn stood alone beneath the darkening sky, silver cord around her wrists, gray dress moving in the wind, the handkerchief pressed to her heart. Then her knees weakened, and the snow rose to meet her like silence opening its arms. Alpha King Cassian Blackwood had followed colder trails than this, but none had ever felt so personal. For 3 days, he had ridden through the northern territories with no crown on his head and no rest in his bones. Only black royal armor beneath a heavy fur cloak, and the crimson mantle of his house snapping behind him whenever the wind rose. Ice clung to the polished metal plates across his shoulders. Snow gathered in the dark length of his hair. At his side, the king's sword moved with each step of his warhorse, quiet and steady, a promise no enemy of his bloodline would mistake for decoration. Around him rode 20 of the royal guard, their lanterns hooded, their voices silent. No one spoke Prince Rowan's name unless Cassian did first. No one asked what would happen if they found the boy too late. Cassian had forbidden despair by the simple act of refusing to carry it. Yet beneath his stillness, his wolf paced like a storm trapped behind ribs. Rowan was 8 years old. He hated carrots, collected smooth river stones, and pretended not to be afraid of thunder because he thought king's sons were not allowed to fear anything. Cassian had watched him sleep through fevers, watched him learn to tie his boots, watched him laugh at birds stealing crumbs from the palace steps. Now every mile of empty snow felt like an accusation. The trail had led them from a broken carriage road to an abandoned hunting path, then toward Raven Hollow lands, where too many answers had gone suddenly quiet. His scouts had found traces of small footprints near the old east pasture, then adult tracks circling them, then nothing after the storm moved in. Someone had tried to clean the world. Cassian knew that kind of silence. It was the silence of guilt pretending to be weather. Near Frostpine Ridge, the wind turned savage, flattening the lantern flames and pushing the horses sideways. Captain Elias Ward urged his mount closer. Your Majesty, we should wait until first light. The ridge drops hard beyond the pines. We could lose men in this. Cassian did not look at him. His gaze stayed fixed on the white dark slope ahead, where the forest seemed to hold its breath. My son does not get first light if he is out there tonight. Elias bowed his head and said nothing more. The column pressed on another quarter-mile before Cashin's wolf froze. Not from scent. The storm had ruined scent. Not from sound. The wind swallowed sound. It was something deeper, older, a pulse beneath the snow so faint that any other alpha might have mistaken it for imagination. A heartbeat. Weak. Slipping. Alone. Cashin lifted one hand, and 20 riders stopped at once. The sudden quiet rang louder than the storm. He turned his horse toward the ridge hollow. There, he said. Elias squinted through the blowing snow. I see nothing. Cashin was already dismounting. His boots sank several inches into the drift, but he moved as if the mountain had no right to slow him. The crimson cloak dragged behind him, staining the whiteness with royal color. He reached the hollow and dropped to one knee, sweeping snow aside with gloved hands. Then with bare hands, when leather dulled what instinct demanded he feel. The cold bit into his fingers. He ignored it. Beneath the surface, gray cloth appeared. Then black hair. Then a face so pale and still that even the guards behind him forgot how to breathe. Cashin cleared the snow from her mouth and cheeks with a gentleness no battlefield had ever seen from him. She was young, fragile-looking, her lashes jeweled with frost, her wrists bound in silver cord. An Omega, not Rowan. For one sharp instant, disappointment struck him, and he hated himself for it. Then her fingers twitched around something pressed to her chest. Cashin eased it free just enough to see the white handkerchief, embroidered at the corner with a small black wolf and a silver crown. Rowan's. The world narrowed. The storm, the guards, the ridge, all of it fell away. This dying girl had held his son's handkerchief like a prayer. Cashin bent closer, and her lips moved, barely shaping sound. Do not let them hurt the boy, she whispered. The words entered him more deeply than any blade ever could. Not a confession, not a bargain. A plea for someone else while her own life faded in the snow. Cashin slid one arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her against his chest. The moment his skin brushed hers, his wolf rose with a force that shook every shadow in him awake. Mate. The command was not spoken. It thundered through bone, blood, breath, and the ancient places beneath thought. Cashin went utterly still, holding the forgotten Omega beneath his crimson cloak while snow spun around them like the sky had shattered. Then his voice cut through the storm, low and absolute. Bring the healers. Now. And send riders to Raven Hollow. No one leaves that pack before I arrive. The royal healers reached Frostpine Ridge in less than 15 minutes, though afterward none of them could explain how their horses crossed the broken snow so quickly. Perhaps it was the king's command still ringing in the air. Perhaps it was the sight of Cashin Blackwood kneeling in the storm with an unconscious Omega held beneath his cloak, his black armor iced white at the edges, his bare hands wrapped around hers, as if his own warmth could bargain with winter. Evelyn did not wake when they cut the silver cord from her wrists. She did not stir when the healers placed heated blankets around her or pressed warm stones near her sides. Only once did her breathing catch, and Cashin's wolf surged so violently that every guard nearby lowered his eyes. Easy, the chief healer murmured, though no one knew whether she spoke to the king or the girl. Cashin did not answer. He watched Evelyn's face, the fragile movement beneath her lashes, the faint tremor in her lips, as if she was still trying to speak through snow and fear. She looked nothing like the kind of woman courts praised. No jewels, no silk, no practiced smile shaped for power. Her dark hair was tangled from the storm, her plain gray dress stained with travel and cold, her cheeks hollow with exhaustion. Yet the bond inside him recognized her with a certainty older than law. Mate, not a wish, not a weakness, a fact written into the marrow of the world. Captain Elias returned from the ridge trail with 2 scouts at his back. Your Majesty, the tracks lead from Raven Hollow. A sleigh came here and turned back less than an hour ago. Cashin's gaze did not leave Evelyn. How many? 2 guards in the sleigh. Possibly more waiting farther south. The storm has blurred the rest. Cashin's hand closed, carefully around Rowan's handkerchief, now folded beside Evelyn's palm. And my son. Elias hesitated, and that hesitation cut more deeply than any answer. No confirmed trail yet, but if she carried his token, she may know where he was taken. At the sound of Rowan's name, Evelyn moved. It was barely anything, a turn of her head, a small breath broken by urgency. Her fingers searched blindly until they found Cashin's sleeve. The strength of that tiny grip stilled him completely. Her eyes opened just a fraction, dark and unfocused, seeing stormlight, armor, the shape of a man too powerful to belong to any ordinary dream. Fear crossed her face first, then effort. "The boy," she whispered. Cashin leaned closer. Snow slid from his hair onto the red cloak around her. "Where is he?" Evelyn swallowed, her voice thin as thread. "Raven Hollow. They took him inside. Do not let Alpha Hale say I hid him. I only kept him warm." Her lashes fluttered, but she forced herself to continue, as if truth mattered more than breath. "He was scared of a man with a raven ring." Elias went rigid. "Grant Hale wears the raven seal." Cashin's expression did not change, and somehow that was worse than fury. The storm blew around him, but the space near his body seemed suddenly too still, too cold, too dangerous. Evelyn felt it even half-conscious. She tried to pull away, weakly, instinctively, as if she had mistaken his silence for judgment. "Please," she said, "do not take me back to them." Whatever remained of Cashin's restraint shifted. Not shattered. Shifted, like a great door opening in a dark hall. He eased her closer beneath his cloak, shielding her face from the wind with one broad hand. "No one will take you back," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and absolute. "Not while I breathe." Evelyn stared at him, not understanding who he was, only hearing the first safe words the world had given her in years. A tear slipped silently toward her temple, freezing before it could fall far. Cashin brushed it away with his thumb, so gently the healers looked down as if they had witnessed something sacred. Then Evelyn's gaze drifted to the sword at his side, the black wolf. Crest on the hilt, the silver crown worked into the metal. Recognition came slowly, like dawn through frost. Her lips parted. "You are Cashin Blackwood," he said, before fear could finish the thought for her. "Rowan's father." Evelyn's face crumpled, not from terror, but from relief so sudden it hurt to see. "He is alive," she breathed. "He was alive when they took him." Cashin bowed his head once, the gesture almost a vow. "Then I will bring him home." The healers secured Evelyn onto a covered rescue sled lined with furs, but she would not release the edge of Cashin's cloak until he placed Rowan's handkerchief back into her hand. "You held this for him," he said. "Hold it a little longer." As the royal column turned toward Raven Hollow, Cashin walked beside the sled instead of riding ahead. The guards noticed. The healers noticed. Even the horses seemed to understand that the storm had changed direction. Beneath the fur blankets, Evelyn drifted in and out of darkness, hearing only fragments. Hooves, wind, orders, the steady rhythm of the king's steps beside her. And beneath it all, a strange warmth pulsed at her wrist where the silver cord had been, soft as moonlight, patient as destiny, waiting for her to wake and understand that the life Raven Hollow tried to bury had already been claimed by the one man powerful enough to make the whole kingdom answer for it. By the time the royal column reached Raven Hollow, the pack hall had already dressed itself in lies. Lanterns burned at every entrance. Guards stood too straight beside the doors. Smoke rose from the chimneys in calm gray ribbons, as if nothing inside those walls had been frightened, hidden, or stolen. Evelyn drifted beneath the fur blankets on the rescue sled, half awake and half lost to fever dreams, hearing the muted thunder of hooves and the sharper silence that followed when Alpha King Cashin Blackwood stepped into the courtyard. No one announced him. No horn was needed. His presence moved ahead of him like a storm entering a room before the door opens. Raven Hollow wolves gathered at the windows, then at the steps, faces pale in the lantern glow. Alpha Grant Hale came out last, his cloak clasped with the black raven seal, his expression shaped into practiced concern. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "we have been preparing search parties. A terrible misunderstanding has occurred." Cashin did not look at him first. He looked at the ring on Grant's hand, the raven carved into dark metal, and the memory of Evelyn's whisper passed through the cold between them. "A man with a raven ring. Where's my son?" Cashin asked. For words. No roar. No threat. Yet every wolf in the courtyard lowered their gaze. Grant's mouth tightened. "We believed the Omega had taken him beyond the border. We were trying to protect the prince from her instability." From the sled, Evelyn heard the word and flinched as if it had reached through the blankets to touch an old wound. Cashin noticed. His eyes remained on Grant, but one gloved hand lowered to the side of the sled, steadying the fur near Evelyn's shoulder. "Search the hall," he ordered. Royal guards moved at once. Grant took a half step forward, then stopped when Cashin's gaze found him fully. There are kinds of power that need volume. Cashin's did not. Minutes stretched. Snow fell quietly into the courtyard. Then, from somewhere inside the hall, a child's voice cried out, thin but unmistakable. "Father!" The sound struck Cashin hard enough to change his face. Not for the pack, not for the guards, only for the heartbeat of a father who had refused to imagine this moment until it existed. Prince Rowan appeared between two royal soldiers, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, small and pale, but standing. He ran across the courtyard, boots slipping in the snow, and Cashin dropped to one knee before the boy reached him. Rowan collided with him, arms wrapping around his neck, and for one breath the Alpha King was not a ruler, not a legend, not the Blackwood wolf with a sword at his side. He was simply a father holding his child. Evelyn watched through blurred eyes, and something inside her loosened. The boy was alive. That was enough. It had to be enough. Then Rowan pulled back, saw the rescue sled, and his silver eyes widened. "Evelyn." Cashin turned. The child slipped from his father's arms and ran to her. Sighed before anyone could stop him. He took her cold hand between both of his, careful of the marks left by the cord. "She saved me," Rowan said, his small voice shaking but clear enough for the courtyard to hear. "She hid me in the stable when the bad men came back. She gave me her shawl. She told me I was safe." Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat closed. Rowan looked at the pack gathered on the steps, and childhood fear gave way to a prince's first courage. "She did not take me. They did." Grant's face lost its color. Grace Miller, standing near the doorway with tears on her cheeks, covered her mouth. Marin Hale looked away too quickly. Cashin rose slowly, Rowan's hand still in his. "Take the prince to the royal carriage," he said to Elias, his voice controlled with effort. Rowan shook his head. "She has to come too." For the first time that night, Cashin's expression softened. "She will." Evelyn's eyes fluttered open wider as Cashin approached the sled. She expected distance now. The prince was found. Her usefulness was over. That was how life had always worked. But Cashin removed his crimson cloak from his own shoulders and laid it over her blankets, covering the plain gray dress Raven Hollow had mocked, the fragile body they had abandoned, the Omega they had decided would not be missed. Warmth and royal color settled around her like a promise. "You are not staying here," he said. Evelyn looked at him, at the handsome severity of his face, at the black armor marked by snow, at the sword of a king resting beside him. "I have nowhere else," she whispered. Cashin leaned closer, not enough to frighten her, only enough that his words belonged to her before they belonged to anyone watching. "Then you will come to Blackwood Palace until you decide where home should be." Rowan climbed into the carriage beside her and refused to let go of her hand all the way through the night. When Evelyn finally woke again, it was not to snow or judgment, but to firelight, clean linen, and the soft sound of the prince asleep in a chair beside her bed, still guarding the girl who had guarded him first. Blackwood Palace did not feel like a place built for sleep. Even from the healer's chamber, Evelyn could sense its vastness breathing beyond the walls, all polished stone, high windows, and corridors guarded by wolves whose silence felt older than law. Morning light spilled across the floor in pale gold, touching the edge of the bed where she sat wrapped in Cashin's crimson cloak because no one had asked for it back. Her wrists had been cleaned and bandaged. Her hair had been brushed by a maid who spoke gently and never once looked at Evelyn, as if a gray dress made her less worthy of warmth. Beside the hearth, Prince Rowan slept curled in a chair too large for him, one hand still resting over the white handkerchief on his lap. Every few minutes, Evelyn looked at him just to make sure he was real. Safe. Breathing. Home. The door opened without ceremony, and Cashin stepped in, wearing black cord armor instead of travel gear, the scratches on the metal catching the firelight like thin lines of silver. His long dark hair was tied back, his sword at his side, his face as controlled as winter before a storm. Yet when his gaze found Rowan asleep beside her, something in him softened so quickly Evelyn wondered if anyone else ever saw it. "He refused his own room," Cashin said. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I am sorry. Do not apologize for being trusted." The answer came so simply that she had no defense against it. A healer entered behind him with a tray of tea and bowed. "Your Majesty, the Raven Hollow delegation has arrived." Evelyn's fingers tightened in the cloak. Cashin saw it. "You do not have to face them." For a moment, the offer was almost unbearable. A door left open. A choice. Raven Hollow had taken so many choices from her that freedom itself felt frightening. She looked at Rowan, at the child who had found courage in a courtyard full of adults, then back at the king. "Will the truth be heard if I am not there?" Cashin's eyes held hers. "Yes." Her breath shook. "Then I want to be there anyway." The great hall of Blackwood Palace rose like a cathedral of shadow and moonlight. Banners of the Black Wolf hung between marble pillars. Snow-bright windows towered over a floor polished so deeply that every figure appeared doubled. Beneath their feet, as if the hall itself remembered who stood with honor and who stood with lies. Grant Hale arrived in formal black, Marin at his side, Grace Miller behind them with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. They all looked smaller here, not because the palace was large, but because truth had room to stand up. Evelyn entered last, still in her plain gray dress beneath the crimson cloak. A murmur moved through the gathered court when they saw her, but Cashin's hand lifted slightly, and the sound died. He did not place her behind him. He offered his arm, and when she hesitated, he waited. The waiting mattered. It told the entire room she was not being displayed. She was being respected. Evelyn placed her hand lightly on his arm, and together they walked to the center of the hall. Grant bowed low. "Your Majesty, Raven Hollow grieves deeply for the confusion surrounding the Omega." Cashin's voice was quiet. "Her name is Evelyn Harper." Grant's jaw worked once. Of course, Evelyn Harper acted alone in a manner that endangered the prince. "We intended to detain her until your arrival, but she fled during the storm." Evelyn felt the old fear rise, familiar and suffocating. Then Rowan stepped from behind a pillar near the throne, dressed in a navy coat, pale but steady. "That is not true." Grant's face froze. The court turned. Rowan held up the handkerchief. "She kept this because I gave it to her. I told her not to say my name because I was scared. The men who took me wore Raven Hollow colors." Cashin looked toward Grace. "And you?" Grace shook as if the hall were colder than Frostpine Ridge. "I saw Evelyn carry him from the abandoned stable. I saw the guards take her away after she told Alpha Hale the prince feared a man with a raven ring. I was afraid. I stayed silent." Tears slipped down her cheeks. But she was innocent. Marin whispered Grant's name, not in comfort, but warning. Cashin turned his hand, and Captain Elias placed a sealed packet in his palm. "Our scouts found the sleigh tracks," Cashin said. "They found the silver cord cut from her wrists. They found the room where my son was held. Your own men have already confessed enough to spare." This court further insult. Grant's carefully built dignity cracked. "Your Majesty, I did what I thought necessary to protect my pack." Cashin's gaze sharpened, and the hall seemed to lose several degrees of warmth. "You protected your name. She protected my son." He drew his sword, not in violence, but in judgment, the blade gleaming beneath the high windows as he set its point against the stone. "You abandoned an innocent woman in a storm and called it order. You buried the truth in snow and called it loyalty. Hear me clearly, Grant Hale. Raven Hollow will answer under royal law." The court went silent. Evelyn stood very still, waiting for the familiar shame to return, but it did not. Something else came instead, fragile and bright. Relief. Cashin turned toward her then, before the court, before the liars, before the kingdom's watching eyes. His voice softened, but it carried to every corner. "Evelyn Harper, you owe this room nothing. But this room owes you the truth." For the first time in her life, no one laughed when she lifted her head. Evelyn Harper had imagined justice would feel loud, like thunder breaking over a mountain, but when it finally came, it arrived as silence. Grant Hale was escorted from the great hall beneath royal guard, his raven ring removed and placed on the stone floor as evidence, no longer a symbol of authority, but only a small dark thing that had lost its power. Marin followed with her eyes lowered, and the Raven Hollow delegation seemed to shrink with every step away from the throne. No one cheered. No one needed to. The truth had done what shouting never could. It had stood in the center of the room and made every lie look small. Evelyn remained where she was, wrapped in the crimson cloak, her hand resting lightly on Cashin's arm because her knees still did not fully trust the world beneath her. Grace Miller lingered near the doors, crying quietly. When Evelyn looked at her, the old hurt rose, but it no longer owned the whole of her. Grace bowed her head. "I should have spoken sooner," she whispered. Evelyn thought of the snow, the sleigh bells, the moment silence had abandoned her. Forgiveness did not come all at once. It came like spring thaw, slow and uncertain. "Yes," Evelyn said softly. "You should have." Grace flinched, but Evelyn's voice held no cruelty, only truth. "But you spoke today." Grace nodded through tears, and for now, that was enough. Prince Rowan crossed the hall with determined steps and slipped his small hand into Evelyn's. "Are you coming home with us?" he asked. Home. The word opened inside her like a window in a locked room. Evelyn looked at Cashin, expecting command, expectation, perhaps the weight of a bond she did not yet understand. Instead, the Alpha King stood still beside her, tall and broad-shouldered in black armor, his long dark hair falling against the fur at his collar, his sword quiet at his side. His face was powerful enough to frighten a court, but his eyes, when they rested on her, asked instead of took. "Blackwood Palace is open to you," he said. "Not as a debt, not as a prison, as shelter, for as long as you choose it." Something warm pulsed beneath the bandage at Evelyn's wrist. She looked down. A pale silver light shimmered there, soft at first, then brighter, tracing the place where the silver cord had marked her skin. The court inhaled as one. Cashin went very still. Rowan smiled as if he had known before anyone else. The mark did not erase the hurt. It did not hide what had been done. It glowed through it, turning the evidence of survival into something holy. Evelyn felt the bond then, not as a chain, not as a demand, but as a door opening toward warmth. Pine forests after snow, firelight against black stone, a heartbeat answering hers with patient strength. She understood why Cashin had looked at her in the storm as if the world had shifted beneath his feet. Destiny had not arrived to make her small. It had arrived to show her that she had never been small at all. Murmurs swept through the court, astonished, reverent, afraid. The forgotten Omega in the plain gray dress stood beneath the high windows with the Alpha King's cloak around her shoulders and the moon's mark shining at her wrist. Cashin did not announce her as his mate. He did not claim her before she could claim herself. He simply offered his hand in front of everyone, who had learned to measure worth by rank, scent, and strength. Evelyn looked at that hand, strong enough to command armies, gentle enough to wait. Then she looked at Rowan, alive because kindness had mattered on a night when no one else was watching. At last, she placed her hand in Cashin's. The bond warmed, steady and bright, and somewhere beyond the palace glass, snow began to fall again, not as a burial, but as a blessing. Cashin's fingers closed around hers with careful reverence. "What do you want, Evelyn Harper?" he asked. No one had ever asked her that in a room full of power. She lifted her chin, and this time, her voice did not tremble. "I want the people Raven Hollow forgot to be protected. I want no Omega left outside the law because they are easy to blame. And I want the prince to eat something besides sweet rolls before dinner." Rowan gasped in betrayal. A soft laugh moved through the hall, gentle and relieved, and even Cashin's mouth curved. It was not the ending Raven Hollow had written for her. It was better. In the weeks that followed, royal riders carried new decrees through the Northern Territories, and every pack learned that weakness was no excuse for cruelty, silence was no shield for guilt, and an Omega's life was not a small thing. As for Evelyn, she stayed at Blackwood Palace first for healing, then for Rowan. Then, because one evening she realized she no longer looked toward the door as if expecting to be sent away. The gray dress remained in her wardrobe, cleaned and folded, not as shame, but as witness. And when she walked beside Cashin beneath the winter moon, crimson cloak over her shoulders and silver mark glowing softly at her wrist, people whispered that the snow had tried to hide a broken girl. But the Alpha King had found a queen.